Prologues, love him or hate him? Hopping in here on a Friday morning to answer this super important question by Leanne S. She says the novel that she's working on starts out with a prologue and then jumps back 5 years. Her question is really, does she start the next chapter and call it chapter 1, or is it chapter 3, or what the heck? Then she's got some more suggestions and questions about how this should all go down. And it sounds like she's had a ton of different opinions on this matter. So thank you, Leanne, for reaching out with this super important question, because it can be really frustrating to get conflicting advice. And I want to talk about prologues and how to label them once and for all. Because the worry is that a prologue might actually kill your book, or maybe it could work. So what do you do? For those of you who are new to writing, a prologue is simply a chapter or a snippet that you put before the story begins in your book that you really, as the writer, feel like the reader has to know. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And sometimes when you hear so many different views on something like whether or not to include a prologue or how to label it, it's easy to think that we're just taking a poll of opinions of readers and writers and potentially publishers. And as writers, let's face it, we'd like to think that our taste is the only thing that matters. But when there are such polarizing views out there on things like prologues, I can assure you that there's way more at stake than just our personal preference. Let's break it down. Prologues are used to set the stage for the book. They're typically something that happens before the story gets going, like an event that the writer really wants to explain to the reader before they get into their book. We want readers to get it. The problem with this, and the reason that prologues get a bad rap, is they can be a really lazy way for writers to information dump all over the place, all the backstory that they had dreamed up in their head, with very little care for hooking your reader right off the bat. Now, prologues were a device that were super popular in books decades ago, but they are much less common now, and I'm going to explain why. In fact, nowadays, for many agents, publishers, and avid readers, it's a quick way to decide that they're not going to read a book and reject it outright. Unfortunately, it's an easy way for them to assume that the writer hasn't done the work to engage the reader right off the bat. Okay, so now that you understand where this bias against prologues comes from, it should be clear that if you include one, you run the risk of turning off a whole group of readers, of agents, of publishers right from the get-go without them ever diving into your story. And I never recommend that you do anything to narrow the pool of potential readers. Why would you make things harder on yourself? But what if there's truly a really good reason why the reader needs this information, which it sounds like is the case in Leanne's? A prologue might be a really effective way to give us information on a character's past, on the world that you are setting the story in and historical events within it. Or it might be a way to give us information from a different point of view that your characters don't know about, but that they really want the reader to know. So there are reasons why you might need a little bit of this backstory. But before you type in prologue and dump all that information in there, I'd urge you to think long and hard, because there are more effective ways to deliver this information that you need the reader to know. Okay, and number one, I think it should be really clear right now that you should take a look and see what information does your reader truly need. You, the writer, you need that information. You need to know about your character's backstory, and you may have spent pages and pages writing about this, and you might be super proud of all the stories that you created, but that doesn't give you carte blanche to just stick it at the beginning of your book, because it's not going to hook your reader. It'll be way more effective if you actually do the work and figure out how to craft it inside the other chapters of your book, dripping out that information as your reader needs it. It's going to be way more exciting for the reader, but it is a little bit more work. I get it. If you really need the story, you decide that you do, make sure that you have written an actual scene and not just a whole list of stuff that happened in your world or to your character before your story began. What do I mean by that? Make sure it's grounded in a particular moment in time. When we're introducing things that happen before the story, sometimes it's easy to just list them out, but bring us to a moment where the character is experiencing it. If it's 5 years prior, make sure that we're actually in story present 5 years prior, that we're hearing what's happening, that we're seeing what's happening, that we're interacting with the setting, that your point of view character, who your reader wants to be, is actually in a moment. Okay, Leanne, if you still know that your prologue is necessary beyond a reasonable doubt, label it as chapter 1. Now, this might seem really simple, but if you label your prologue as chapter 1, it does a bunch of things. It's going to remind you that you have to do a lot of work to that opening chapter in order to hook your readers. Even if it's technically something that happened before the story, you better make it just as good as you would make chapter 1. It also means that a reader, an agent, a publisher isn't going to put your book down right away just because it has a prologue, if that's their bias. It might mean that 20 to 50% more readers will give your book a try, so do that. Okay, now I know I'm going to get a ton of hate comments on this post that say, now Susie, I just read this really recent book that did super well from a big publisher and it had a prologue, so you're out to lunch and I can still do it. And yes, absolutely, prologues are still included in books in certain cases. I totally agree. In fact, this year I worked with one of my writers who is working on book 3 with a major publishing house, and her editor actually suggested that for book 3, she create a prologue. And it was on purpose, and it's in the book. But in that circumstance, this writer already had a loyal following. It's book 3. So readers are willing to tolerate a little bit more. It was also in a historical genre, which means that you have a little more leeway to tell the history because that's what readers actually love. If your book truly needs a prologue, and yeah, there's times that this can be really effective, you can always rename chapter 1 prologue later. But why narrow your pool of potentially interested publishers right off the bat? If you're new here, I'm Susie Vidori. I'm an author, I'm an editor, I'm also a book coach. I break down complex writing concepts into practical tips that you can use right away to make your books wow your readers, so you can get your message out there. If you're writing a book, follow me to get all my practical tips and my best advice from over a decade in the writing industry. Have a question about the book you're writing? Drop it in the comments and I'll answer.